Hey there. Last week, the Trump administration announced a peace deal between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. Details are sketchy, but this is supposedly going to lead to the full normalization of trade, diplomatic, and even tourism relations between the two countries. My initial instinct when I heard about this, as it is with many Trump initiatives, was to call it a nothing burger. Having thought about it, though, I don't think that's true. This deal is actually tremendously significant, though not in exactly the ways that Israel, the UAE, and Donald Trump seem to think it is. This is not a good deal for the Palestinians. It's not really a Middle East peace deal as we used to understand it. Yeah, supposedly Israel gave up the annexation of Palestinian territory that would have ruined its relationship with the next US president, but that was more about salvaging the wreckage of the two-state solution than it was about this deal. The fundamental message of this deal for the Palestinians is a very simple and very contemptuous one. It's that nobody cares about the Palestinians anymore. That message is really unfortunate, and it doesn't happen to be true, like, at all. But I think this deal has a significance that goes far beyond the 5 to 10 million Palestinian lives it affects directly. In fact, I think that this deal could have major significance for all of the 400 million plus people living in the Arab world. I'm going off the deep end way into wild speculation with this video, but I suspect that this deal could represent the end of the second era of Arab independence. The first era of Arab independence started in the post-World War II era, when all of the imperial powers that had controlled the Middle East and North Africa for 500 years realized they couldn't afford to do it anymore. This happened unevenly over a 2-decade period. The Israelis were better funded and better organized than anybody else, and due to the horrors of the Holocaust, they were also very motivated. In 1948, they were able to take possession of land that had been run by and principally populated by Muslims for 1,300 years. Now, as an American, it's very easy to say, well, it's been 70 years and the Arab world should just get over it. That essentially is what a tiny unelected elite in the United Arab Emirates has just agreed to do. But for the other 400 million Arabs, anger at what Israel did back in 1948 is still a key part of their identity, and I get it. Just as they were finally picking themselves back up after 500 years of oppression, a bunch of Europeans showed up and took a bunch of their traditional land and turned hundreds of thousands of Arabs into refugees. Israel has been the symbol of Arab humiliation for 72 years now. The Arab world faces many other challenges, but any leader who has ideas about facing any of those challenges is defined by his ability to confront Israel. Since Arab independence, I think many historians would agree that there have been two overall strategies that have been tried. Both of these strategies have been around for hundreds of years, but you can divide the period of independence into two different eras, each dominated by a separate model. These models aren't just about confronting Israel, they were about everything: government, society, religion. The first model was Westernization, or modernization. This approach has roots going all the way back to Napoleon's invasion, which we talked about earlier this year. The idea is to beat the Europeans at their own game, build up a modern nationalist structure, take back Arab leadership in science, build a powerful military, etc., etc. The most famous modernizing Arab nationalist figure was Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and his victory in the 1956 Suez Crisis probably represented the high watermark of this approach. Nasser is now becoming better known for his mocking of headscarves and his cheerful embrace of modernity, but it's important to remember that he also emulated European nationalism's darker aspects as well. He set up a brutal one-party state, and he pursued policies that led to most of Egypt's commercially successful minorities fleeing the country. For a second there, in the late 1950s, it looked like Nasser could do no wrong. He even briefly brought Egypt and Syria together in a united Arab republic. But after talking a big game, when he finally faced the Israelis in 1967's Six-Day War, he failed miserably, losing the large tracts of Egyptian and Jordanian land that became the occupied territories. After 1967, the reputation of Arab nationalism faded quickly. Many governments in the region still claim this ideology, but my sense is that it lost the bulk of the Arab people in 1979. In that year, Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, signed a peace deal with Israel. I think that peace deal, which Sadat was assassinated for, by the way, was the end of the first era of Arab independence. There's some other stuff that happened in 1979 too, but I don't want this video to be 45 minutes long, so I'm leaving Iran out of this story. The dominant ideology of the second era has been the return to Islam. After the failure of those who sought to copy the West, many suggested that the Arab world could strengthen itself by returning to its roots. There was a long, well-thought-out intellectual tradition behind this idea, but it was corrupted and turned pathological by the wealth and savagery of Saudi Arabia. The most well-known proponent of the fundamentalism of this era would probably be Osama bin Laden, that most famous of Saudi Arabians. The Saudis and other Gulf countries like the UAE poured hundreds of billions of dollars into fostering grim ideas of Islamic supremacy all over the world. This approach probably reached its peak with 9/11, an event that was no doubt emotionally satisfying to some in the region, but ultimately left the Arabs weaker than they had ever been. The dirty secret of this era of self-strengthening through extremism is that it has always been a sick joke. Saudi Arabia has basically been a US colony for over half a century now. All of this fundamentalism that Saudi Arabia was pumping out was encouraged by the United States to serve United States foreign policy goals. First opposition to the Soviet Union, and now opposition to Iran. Gulf monarchies like the UAE would fund vicious anti-Western ideologies that turned multiple Arab countries into killing fields at the exact same time as they were signing bigger and bigger deals with Western companies. The spectacular flameout of the Islamic State is probably this second era's equivalent of the failed Arab nationalist wars on Israel. The horrors of Mosul and Raqqa show that Islamic extremism has failed utterly in strengthening the Arab world. It's done the exact opposite, in fact. And last week, the UAE, one of the largest supporters of anti-democratic religious extremism, signaled the end of this second era by signing a deal with Israel. The 1979 deal with Egypt was tremendously important for Israel's security. The two countries shared a border and had fought a serious conventional war as recently as 1973, backed by opposing nuclear-armed superpowers. The United Arab Emirates is 1,000 miles from Israel, and it is similarly aligned with the United States. It never posed any threat to Israel. This deal is far more significant for what it says about the politics of the Arab world than it is for Israel's security. Because this deal doesn't just abandon the Palestinians, it abandons the rest of the Arab world as well. After spending a decade crushing every attempt at Arab democracy, the UAE has now taken this step that illustrates complete contempt for the will of its own people and for the Arab world in general. The UAE-Israel peace deal is a victory dance on the corpse of the Arab Spring, and it's not something we should be celebrating. Luckily, I do think there's a way forward here. The third era of Arab independence has already begun. Real Arab democracy began in Tunisia in 2011, and it has not been easy, but they have hung on against all odds ever since. Tunisia has demonstrated that a representative system can thrive while trying to include the best of the Arab nationalist and Islamic tendencies. The Middle East will continue to suffer the effects of Saudi Arabia's era of dominance for decades to come, but across North Africa, you can see glimpses of the next, more democratic paradigm in Sudan, Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, and even Libya, potentially. This third era of Arab independence finally promises real freedoms and growing strength for these countries. I want Arab countries to make peace with Israel. That old idea of sending all the Israelis back to Europe is just as dead as Nasser's dream of uniting the Arab world in a single country. Too much time has passed. All of these countries are too well established. Peace is the only way forward. But that peace can't be imposed on the Arab people by a set of medieval monarchies while half the region is still burning down because of the actions of Israel's superpower patron, the United States. Peace must be chosen by the Arab people from a more democratic space of wealth and security. Thankfully, that's exactly what I think the third era of Arab independence could bring. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And if you want a free essay on a completely different topic, you can sign up for my email newsletter here.